the truth is, following that, I'm phenomenally nervous for two reasons. One, because it was said to be the longest applause ever in the history of this four-year event. And the second, because I'm going to talk to you about politics and technology. I'm actually going to take one of your favorite words, technology, and I'm going to mix it with a word that you might not find quite as appealing. And I'm going to tell you why. So I was on the train up here, and I was reading Peter Thiel's book. Peter Thiel being an ex-operator at PayPal, one of the first investors in Facebook. And he wrote a book called 0 to 1. And in that book, he actually has a very interesting part where he talks about secrets. He says every big business that existed is founded on a secret, something that you know to be true that the outside world thinks is false. So I believe I've got a secret, and I wanted to share it to you because I believe that maybe you can use it to found an extremely big business. And I believe a lot of businesses can use it to become even bigger than they are. So the secret is about politics. The traditional vogue thinking in Silicon Valley is that politics and regulation and startups simply don't mix, and they shouldn't mix, that startups should ignore regulation. I don't believe that that is true. My experience is that regulators are going to regulate whether you're in the conversation or not, whether you're in an industry that is currently regulated or will be regulated. If you have an impact on society, politics will be there. And if you are not engaged in those conversations, they will go on without you. And ultimately, although it may take days, years for those blowbacks to be certain, they will come. And that's another thing about why I think politics and regulation, or politics and technology haven't mixed well, is there is a vast difference in time horizon. When you're an entrepreneur thinking about next year, unless it's a minute to midnight, is a lot. When you're a politician thinking about next year or next quarter or about the next 10 years, it's commonplace because that's the amount of time that it takes for things to get done. So let me tell you about a little bit from my own experience building a couple of different companies. So by way of background, I've been an entrepreneur for as long as I can remember. I actually registered the domain name classof2001.com in 1997 when I was about to enter college. Therefore, with the idea that you could have a social network that kind of connects people in college, if you catch my drift, from one place to another, starting in universities and eventually taking over the world. But I missed that boat. Then I started something called eCourier. And eCourier is still around in London, although it has different owners. eCourier is a service that is not regulated, that uses couriers to basically, or uses technology to improve the efficiency of courier companies and allows you to actually see where your courier is. And really, out of that grew the idea for what would become Halo, which was really all about 2 taps to taxi, or 2 taps to transportation, and pretty soon 2 taps to anything. The idea was, long before people would view this as commonplace, that basically, out in the world, there were many, many people that wanted to provide you things that basically were very, very inefficient, that had lots and lots of free time. And there were many, many people that wanted things that basically you could connect them to. So me and my partners found 3 taxi drivers, which we went out and Terry, Russ, and Gary, who were basically trying to do a very similar thing. And basically, they came up with this idea that you should basically focus squarely on the needs of the driver, on the needs of the supplier, of the provider of whatever good or service it was. And that by doing that, and by creating a happy pool of people who were ready to provide services, that was the best way to make people happy as consumers. But we recognized that this was a regulated industry, that we were going to basically run into, and we were going to have to engage with regulators. So we didn't wait. What we did was we went and talked to them even before they called upon us. And I think that this is a really important thing to do. First of all, it teaches you what's on their mind. And I'm going to tell this story through the lens of New York and London, since London is where the business grew up and New York is where I live right now. So we went and talked to regulators, and they were concerned in London, where we started, about a couple of things. They were concerned about safety. They were concerned about making sure that only licensed drivers were on the system. They were concerned about how this would affect the ecosystem. And so basically we went to them, we talked to them, and out of that came actually a couple of interesting things. One is the ability to provide services for the disabled. So basically we had always had this on our agenda, and it had been a personal passion of mine to make sure that things like Halo could be used to basically allow people who were of disabilities, who couldn't walk, to be able to provide, match them with service providers who could, as there are only some taxis in any city that can provide service to disabled people. And so we went out and found tons of people who were disabled. We talked to them. We found out what their needs were, and we built a product around that. And sure enough, that would become part of the eventual regulations that regulators would have for this product or service. So the second thing was allowing licensed drivers. Now, this is something that basically we would have done anyway, and we already did. So basically, it's an exemplar of a lot of the rules and regulations you will run into are things that you would have already have done. It wasn't to our advantage to basically allow unlicensed drivers onto the system, and the reason is basically that would make, if anybody had an accident or had an insurance claim, that would basically cause a lot of bad things to happen. Like I said, I'm incredibly nervous following that act. So anyway, we went to New York. And we launched in London. It was very, very successful. There were lots of people who were using it, and we had data. And so we went to New York, and what was, interestingly, this very same principles and the very same conversation that occurred at some windowless offices in Transport for London in London became actually, a major multi-million-dollar lawsuit in New York. And of course, it's New York style. And why is that? Well, the reason is that when I think about regulations and the difference between New York and London, I think that really it's reflective of what people's view is of human nature. So if you look at Silicon Valley, I think their view of human nature is one of idyllic. It's kind of reflected by the campuses that they have, right? People are good, we hire good people, everybody is smart, everybody's well off, everybody's well educated. And therefore, why would people ever do bad things? If you look at some place like London, generally their attitude is, look, as long as it's not hurting anybody, it's probably okay. At least that's what we found in our microcosm of the world, or so we like to think about it. In New York, it seems like it's Batman's Gotham. To anybody or any regulator there, I'm going to think about the world from the perspective of the most harmful, possibly demonic person, and then think about how that might be done, then ask you how your product or service addresses that. And so what was a couple of pages of clarification of existing legislation in London became tens of pages, and literally a lawsuit by the Private Hire Association against the regulator to basically get to a conclusion that said exactly what London had already said before, absent all that. But I guess that's a conversation that you still have to have, in my view. And I certainly don't regret anything about us going through and having those conversations. In fact, I think that basically there will be the opportunity in the future for people to create businesses all about this regulatory asymmetry, because it's not going away. The reason why I'm having this discussion about politics and technology is because people are creating services now that have an impact on people's lives that is perennially greater than they ever would. 1-year-old, 2-year-old companies are starting to impact the way that you actually go about your daily habits versus something that is, say, just a kind of substitute for television or anything else, not to name any names. So, and I think mobile technology is definitely bucking that trend. So when we think about what things are going to be like in the future, and you think about what businesses you're going to create, I think you have to think about what impact on society is it going to have, and therefore which politicians and which regulators are going to basically deal with this. And then try and get to them before they get to you, or before your competition does. Because I think ultimately that's what's going to create a competitive advantage in the future. I also believe that it is possible that basically someone could create a business based on this lack of knowledge about regulation and basically knowing more about how a technology was going to be regulated in the future than it actually was. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you take another area of technology that you think is going to be regulated in the future, and you really think about it, and you think about, well, look, this is going to be regulated, how are the regulations going to fall? What kind of help do the regulators need in order to do this? Then potentially that in and of itself is the opportunity to create a vast, vast business. And so, anyway, I'm really nervous, but that's my secret. And that's what I wanted you to know. So thank you guys very much.